Good morning, church. I know it's 9:15, but I'll say it again. Good morning, church. All right, there you go. Welcome. So happy to have you here. And for those that are joining us online, whether you're on the couch or whether you're in a different city or country, we just want to take this moment to welcome you. This morning, I'll start with a question. Have you ever had to search for meaning in your life? To try and figure out what's worth your energy, your time, and your passion. Well, about 2 years ago, not 2 years ago, but 2 years after I got married, I thought I knew what I wanted to do with my life. I spent most of that 2 years in Kenya. We were heading back to Ontario, Canada, to start a new chapter in our lives, me and Jessica. Now, I was confident about my next step, which included continuing briefly as a young adult pastor in the church I've served for about 7 years, with the plan to take them up on an offer to oversee one of their church plants in another city. Now, in 2011, I was excited about this opportunity. But once we came back to Canada, we stepped into what I call a church's nightmare. One of the most influential pastor, Jess and I were very close to him. And we thought that he was going to be the guy who would inherit 100 churches worldwide because it was a church planting organization. He decided to leave, and it was like a whirlwind that hit our church, our branch. Now, the senior leaders at the time, although I loved that church branch, were so focused on the split, it seemed to hijack our vision for moving forward. Instead, we focused a lot on the ugliness of the split. My plans were paused. And after 3 years in this, I found my passion for ministry beginning to dwindle. I remember wrestling with what I would do, what I was planning on doing, and I just wanted to serve God. What was happening? All my plans seemed to just explode in my face. I remember getting to a place where I said to myself, enough is enough. I did this ministry thing for about 11 years. Now it's time to kind of spread my wings and fly out of this nest. I set up a transition plan with a few youth leaders and the pastor of our branch. And in 2014, my wife and I had a great transition out of ministry. You know, at that time I felt, free at last. Free at last. Thank God I'm free at last. Often our search for meaning just doesn't happen. My search began due to an organizational crisis. The church that I loved, the split caused a lot of grief and heartbreak and prompted me to ask questions. Do I really want to serve in a church? I guess the answer was yes, because I'm still working for a church, right? Now, we often search for meaning due to experiences of suffering, loss, or achieving success only to feel empty afterwards. For some, it's situations of injustice, identity struggles, fear of lack, fear of debt. This search can also be sparked by a moral convictions, loneliness, or feeling disconnected despite finding ourselves surrounded by people. Often the madness happening around us and sometimes the madness in us can lead us to search for meaning. Now, if you're joining us for the very first time, we're currently in week 2 of our series called Vanity Fair, Searching for the Meaning in the Madness. And last week, Pastor Todd introduced us to a book of Ecclesiastes and to the author, King Solomon, who exposes the emptiness of life under the sun. And today, we will continue reading Ecclesiastes, but we're going to go into chapter 2. As Solomon continues his search for meaning, which alludes to the chaos we can experience in life, but also at the same time, it gives us some beautiful insights. We'll be looking at what I'm calling the madness and the masterpieces from the words of God inspired by this great king. Today, I guess my job is to guide us through this book, through this chapter, with the hopes we can catch and see the madness and the masterpiece and to do something about it. Now, before we read chapter 2, I would like to turn our attention to a question again. What caused Solomon to go on this search for life's meaning? Last week, again, we talked about Solomon's accomplishment, and we learned that he was a fascinated human being. Before conferences were invented, people would travel bearing gifts just to listen to him speak. If social media was a thing back then, he would probably overtake Cristiano Ronaldo, 1 billion followers, and he would always be trending. He did nothing small. Everything he did was big and grand. And he knew how to navigate people, which made him a very likable person, but also very famous. But to understand what brought about his search for meaning, we must first start with his relationship with God. You see, God loved Solomon. In 2 Samuel 12, 24 and 25, we read this. Then David comforted his wife Bathsheba because she lost a child, and he went to her and made love to her. She gave birth to a son, and they named him Solomon, which means peace. The Lord loved him, and because the Lord loved him, he sent word through Nathan the prophet to name him Jedediah. And Jedediah means loved by the Lord. This was not the first time God demonstrated his love for Solomon. We read later in Kings when he grew up and when he became king and when he started to offer offerings to God, that the king went to Gibeon to offer sacrifices. And the Lord appeared to him during the night in a dream and said to Solomon, ask for whatever you want me to give you. Whatever you want, ask of me. The guy got a free wish. God's generous offer demonstrated his favor and love for him. Another time, Solomon actually asked, when God asked him, ask me anything, he asked for wisdom. The Lord was so pleased that he asked for wisdom to actually lead the people, that God decided to give him what he did not ask for, both wealth and honor. And the word says, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings. Not only did God love Solomon, but Solomon also loved God. And in his early reign as king, we're told in 1 Kings 3:3, Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the instructions given him by his father. You see, he had a personal walk with God because that's what David told him. His father said, listen, I've made it this far because of God. And if you want to make it far in life, you got to get connected to God. And Solomon listened to David and began to walk with God. Secondly, in 1 Kings 8, 22 and 23, we learn that Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the front of the whole assembly of Israel. He spread out his hands towards heaven and said, Lord, the God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven or on earth below. You who keep your covenant of love with your servants, who continued wholeheartedly in your way. He had no problem of demonstrating a public affection to God. If he was in our church today, Solomon would sitting somewhere in the front and he would just be one of those guys that's just waving and praising like crazy. And you'd be watching him and say, man, what's happening with this dude? But he demonstrated a public affection for God. And then in 1 Kings 8, 54, 61, we learned that when he was dedicating the temple, at the end, he called all the people to be fully committed to the Lord God, to live by his decree and to obey his commands. So he had no problem calling people to be faithful to God. No problem whatsoever. You see, when Solomon was walking in relationship with God, he was writing books like the Songs of Solomon, a book of love, and putting together wisdom literature that we know today as the book of Proverbs. But then, questions of meaning began to surface in his old age when Solomon turned away from God. In 1 Kings 4:6, we learn that as Solomon grew old, his wives began to turn his heart to other gods. And his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of his father David was. Solomon began to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, and he didn't follow the Lord completely, as David, his father, had done. So, when he turned away from God, what happened is a break in relationship. The connection between him and God began to draw apart. And then God showed up and warned Solomon. The Lord became angry, we learned in 1 Kings 11, with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord. And what God did was crazy. God appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. He's like, no, I'm going to do what I want to do, when I want to do, and how I want to do it. So the Lord said to Solomon, since this is your attitude, and you do not keep my covenant or my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, he says, I will not do it in your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hands of one of your sons. And you see what happened there was a break in covenant blessing. God says, listen, man, I want to bless you, but I need you to do this. Follow me. Solomon said, I'm not going to bless you. So God says, I'm not going to follow you. So God says, well, hold on. There's some of my blessings that will be withheld from you. And God raised up enemies against Solomon. There was 3 guys. One was called Hadad, an Edomite. And he was from a royal line of Edom, an enemy of Israel. And the second was a guy by the name of Rezon, son of Elad. He was a mighty warrior. And then there was another guy by the name of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. And he was very close to Solomon. He actually worked along with Solomon. There's nothing like having an enemy come from your own home. There was a break in peace for Solomon. And it's popular opinion that Solomon began writing the book of Ecclesiastes after the break in relationship, after the break in covenant blessings, and after the break in peace. He was triggered by a crisis. And motivated by this crisis, Solomon reflects and searches for the meaning of life in Ecclesiastes. So we're going to read chapter 2 and we go from 1 to 11 first. Now we're going to be looking for the madness and the masterpiece. He said this, I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is madness. And what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heaven during the few days of their lives. What is meaningful? I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs of water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female servants, slaves, and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasures of kings and provinces. I acquire male and female singers and a harem, a palace built for his wives and concubines as well. The delight of a man's heart. I became a greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this, my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labors, and this was the reward of my toil. Yet, when I surveyed all that my hands had done, and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless. A chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. This pleasure that Solomon went after, the word in Greek means tob, which is good, and which means that which is good, pleasant, and agreeable to the senses, welfare, and happiness. You see, he brought the best comedians and hold the best banquets to fill his heart with laughter. He enjoyed the finest wine, built houses, planted vineyards, gardens, and parks. He built pools, bought slaves, accumulated great possession, herds, flocks, gathered silver, gold, singers to entertain himself, had the most beautiful women in the world. He became famous. He was so successful that he surpassed all those that were before him. He experienced the pinnacle of all pleasures. Yet, he said, everything was meaningless. A chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained. Nothing was added to me. His words were echoed later. What am I saying? Later. Okay, here we go. By a guy that is popular to us, Tom Brady, NFL quarterback, in 2005. In an interview, he said this, why do I have 3 Super Bowl rings and still think there's something greater out there for me? There's got to be more than this. Lady Gaga, a singer and actress, she said, I had all the things I was supposed to have, and I was absolutely miserable. I had no sense of self, no sense of identity. Jim Carrey, an actor and comedian, said, "I think everyone should get rich and famous and do everything they ever dreamed of so they can see that it's not the answer." What we do not see was the boxing match that occurred between Solomon and pleasure. Every punch he landed, he thought he was going to knock pleasure out. So he moved from one thing to the next, from one punch to another, only to find out that this opponent was still standing strong. And here he offers us the madness of pleasure. Pleasure, whether physical or material, can truly never satisfy and will always leave us wanting more. See, Solomon was the master builder, the political genius, the economic strategist, one of the architect of wisdom, the visionary leader. Has also left a masterpiece of advice when it comes to pleasure for us. And the masterpiece of pleasure is this: if you desire to go in the ring with pleasure alone, you will not win. I'm going to say that again. Masterpiece of pleasure. If you desire to go in the ring with pleasure alone, you will not win. Let me ask you this. What physical and material things do you think you need that if only I get this, if only I can achieve this, then everything is going to be good? I'm going to have smooth sailing in life. Solomon said, don't cast your hopes in that thing. And Paul echoes the words of Solomon centuries later when he said this in 1 Timothy 6:7. He says, as for the rich of this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. Now, moving from pleasure, Solomon continues to share with us yet another madness and masterpiece in Ecclesiastes 2:12-16. He says, then I turned my thoughts to consider wisdom and also madness and folly. What more can the king's successor do than what has already been done? I saw that wisdom is better than folly, just as light is better than darkness. The wise have eyes in their heads, while the fool walks in the darkness. But I came to realize that the same fate overtakes them both. Then I said to myself, the fate of the fool will overtake me also. What then do I gain by being wise? I said to myself, this too is meaningless. For the wise, like the fool, will not long be remembered. The days have already come when both have been forgotten. Like the fool, the wise too must die. You see, in considering wisdom, madness, and folly, there is more to gain, according to Solomon, in wisdom. The benefits of wisdom is the ability to see. It's human wisdom that Solomon is also describing. It's like putting two people who are blindfolded in a palace, loaded, or I should say a palace or mansion loaded for a short time with everything they could ever desire. The kind of wisdom Solomon is talking about removes the blindfold from one eye and allows the person total access to everything in the mansion. Now, although wisdom allows us to gain degrees, climb the corporate ladder, get promotions, build a profitable business, accumulate wealth, make wise investment, achieve financial freedom, become popular or influential on social media, public platforms, or creative projects, help us to pursue physical wellness, seek happiness and contentment, it holds no advantage in the face of the grave. Whether we are buried in a vase, a crude wooden box, or a stylish casket transported by a limousine, dead is dead. And a dead genius and a dead fool are equally dead. And here we arrive at the madness of wisdom. The madness of wisdom is this: all we attain by wisdom, by the ability to see in this world and gain, we cannot carry any of it with us. The door of the mansion will be closed, and there is nothing we can take from this world into the next. You know, in James chapter 3, it tells us that also that there are two types of wisdom. There is this wisdom that Solomon is talking about that belongs to men, but there's also a wisdom that belongs to God. And in James 3, it says this. It says, but the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. There is a harvest here for godly wisdom. And the one who cashes that check is God. He's the one who remembers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, though they're long buried and from this side of this world. It is the same God that when Solomon walked away said this, listen, I'm going to spare you because of the righteousness of your father, my servant David, although he's not presently with them. God remembers our acts of wisdom. And this leads us to the masterpiece. Godly wisdom brings material and eternal gains. But Solomon continues to share with us the final madness and masterpiece in Ecclesiastes 2, 70 to 26. And I'm going to read it. Are you okay? Are you with me? All right, we're following. Just wanted to make sure. I see 1 and 2 nods. I'm just trying to make sure, you're awake. Here we go. So I hated life because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. I hated all the things I had toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to the one who comes after me, and who knows whether that person will be wise or foolish. Yet they will have control over all the fruit of my toil, in which I have poured my effort and skill under the sun. This too is meaningless. So my heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor, because he owned a lot under the sun. For a person may labor with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and then they must leave all they own to another who has not toiled for it. This too is meaningless and a great misfortune. Oh, how I could carry it with me, would be what Solomon would be saying. But what do people get for all the toil and anxious striving with which they labor under the sun? All their days, their work is grief and pain. Even at night, their minds do not rest. This too, he said, is meaningless. And then he shift tone a little bit. A person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their toil, their own toil. This too I see is from the hand of God. For without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? To the person who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is meaningless, chasing after the wind. So he thinks of what goes into work, the striving, the preparation, the planning, the goal setting, the sweat, the desire, the love, the passion, the sorrow, the disappointment, the frustration, the worry, the anger, the annoyance, the lack of sleep. Doing all of that only to give it away. Cornelius Vanderbilt, known as the Commodore, amasses one of the largest fortunes in American history through his railroad and shipping empire during the 19th centuries. The man was a genius. His company was worth over $105 million in 1877. I know that is long. But at his death, which would be equivalent to about today to about $3.1 billion. However, by the third generation, much of his wealth had dissipated. His descendants engaged in extravagant spending, building large mansions and indulging in lavish lifestyles without a sustainable financial management plan. This rapid depletion of wealth led to the coining of the phrase, short sleeves to short sleeves in 3 generations, which simply means or shows to highlight how quick family fortunes can be lost. The madness of work is this: all you work for will be given over to someone who may not value it at all. Tom Brady shared, there's got to be more than this. Lady Gaga shared, I had no sense of self, no sense of identity. Jim Carrey said, of riches and fame, it's not the answer. And Solomon tells us it's all meaningless. Yet, he did not leave it there, but encouraged us to look outside of ourselves and to look towards God. And the masterpiece of work is to work at pleasing God, who grants us wisdom, knowledge, and joy to enjoy what we do. So in recap, madness of pleasure, wisdom, and work. Solomon paints us a picture of life's frustration when we seek fulfillment solely in these things. They're not enough. They will never be able to give us ultimate satisfaction or lasting peace. May give us temporary satisfaction, temporary peace, but it's not lasting. The masterpiece, however, is discovered when we shift our perspective and place God at the center of our pursuit of pleasure, of wisdom, and of work. True satisfaction, eternal significance, and lasting fulfillment are found when we live to please God. We receive His wisdom, and we are able to embrace the purpose He gives us in the midst of the madness. You know, when I made the transition from the church in 2014, from my old church, and I didn't come to this church, but when I made that transition, I remember wrestling with God. I remember knowing that I had to leave in around 2013, but it took me a year and a little bit to actually do that. Because I said, God, I know this is not the kind of work that I want. This is not what I think I need to, get myself involved with. And so I wrestled with Him. I remember being in the office of the pastor at my church. And let me tell you, this guy, he was a politician. He was a pastor, but he could have passed for a politician because he works his way around any problem. And so I knew that the moment I say to him, hey, I need to leave, he will say, hey, man, Dunstan, why don't you look at this? He will give me so many reasons to stay. And I remember asking God, I was like, God, listen, I need your help. And one day, I was sitting in my office and I heard very clearly, Dunstan, it's time. And when I heard that time, I felt like a weight just lifted off of me. And I was like, but God, I have a politician there as a pastor. And I know if I go to him, you would need to calm him. And so you would need to talk to him. And so I literally went into his office and I said, Pastor, I just think it's time for Jessica and myself to kind of transition out of this church. And when I said that, he looked up, he looked me right in the face, and he said to me, okay, Dunstan, let's work and let's make a plan of how to make that happen. I was amazed. But the thing is, after I left, I did no searching or wrestling with God for what's next. No, I took everything in my own hands, and I'm like, I'm going to go find a job. And I did find a job. I'm going to make me some money. Thank you, Jesus, for this. And I'm just going to do what I want to do. But before long, ownership changed. And then the principle of the business changed. And it was in conflict with my convictions. And then all of a sudden, the new church that I was going to, honestly, it was a huge church. So I was just hiding. I just chilling. When some people start coming up to me and start asking, hey, man, would you consider doing full-time ministry with us? I'm like, no. No. And in this way, I could relate to Solomon. Here is what I believe to be the true masterpiece. I should say the madness of Ecclesiastes is that we will struggle from time to time, trying, looking, and searching for meaning. The struggle will always be there. But the masterpiece is this. King Solomon, throughout the entire books of Kings and Chronicles that recorded his story, never once did we hear that Solomon, after God confronted him about his sin, that Solomon repented. Never once. Until many years later, sitting in a corner, looking at all that he has accomplished and feeling this sense of meaninglessness, he put pen to paper and began to reflect. And in doing so, began to point himself and others back to God. It may not just be a letter of reflection, but a letter of repentance. And maybe today we are in this room and we've been chasing after pleasure, chasing after the pleasure that comes from work and achievements. God is saying, and what I believe the book of Ecclesiastes is saying, is we need to come to a place where we know that fulfillment and enjoyment of what we have comes from God. And as a result, submit ourselves to Him. Bend the knee and submit to Him. And in doing so, find Him. If we were able, let's rise to our feet and worship Him.